The call lasted only 9 seconds, but it would later be called the moment money failed to silence the truth. Emily Harper Whitmore's hand trembled against the cold hardwood floor as her phone slipped from her fingers, the screen lighting her face in a pale blue glow that made everything feel distant, unreal, like she was watching someone else's life collapse from across the room. Her breath came out uneven, thin, like something inside her chest had forgotten its rhythm, and when she tried to speak, her lips moved but the words dragged behind. Heavy and broken. Pregnant, stroke, help, she whispered, each syllable costing more than the last as the dispatcher's voice came through faint but urgent, asking questions that felt miles away, questions she couldn't answer, not anymore. The room tilted slightly, then steadied, then tilted again, the ceiling fan above her turning in slow, deliberate circles like time itself had decided to move without her, and somewhere deep inside, a sudden, sharp movement reminded her she wasn't alone. The baby shifting, kicking once, then again, as if responding to the rising panic that filled every corner of her body. She tried to focus on that feeling, tried to anchor herself to it, because everything else was slipping, sound stretching and shrinking in waves, her right hand no longer responding the way it should, her thoughts scattering like papers in the wind. Then footsteps, measured, unhurried, echoing from the hallway, and a shadow fell across the light of the phone, cutting it in half. Richard Whitmore stood there, perfectly composed, his tailored suit already on, his watch catching the dim light as he glanced down at her, not with alarm, not with fear, but with something quieter, colder, like mild inconvenience. The dispatcher's voice sharpened through the speaker, asking if anyone else was present, asking if help was on the way, but Richard didn't answer. He simply bent down, picked up the phone, and for a moment the line went silent except for Emily's strained breathing. "You always choose the worst timing," he said under his breath, not loud, not angry, just matter-of-fact, like he was commenting on traffic or weather. And before the dispatcher could speak again, before Emily could try to form another word, his thumb moved across the screen and the call ended, the sound cutting off so abruptly it left a ringing emptiness behind. He didn't look back at her immediately. Instead he checked the time again, adjusted his cufflinks, and exhaled slowly as if resetting himself for something far more important waiting elsewhere. On the floor, Emily's vision blurred at the edges, her body refusing commands that once felt automatic. But through it all, through the silence, through the distance closing in around her, the baby moved again, a small, insistent reminder that something still fought to stay, even as everything else seemed to fade. Richard set the phone down on the nightstand as if nothing urgent had just happened, as if the silence that followed was not heavier than any sound Emily had tried to make, and for a brief second he stood there, looking at her without moving, his expression unreadable, calculating something only he could see. The room felt smaller now, the air thicker, and Emily tried to shift her weight, to pull herself even an inch closer to the edge of the bed where the light from the hallway reached. But her body refused, her right side unresponsive, her thoughts slipping in and out like a weak signal. "You will be fine," Richard said finally, not with concern but with certainty, as though he had already decided the outcome, and he reached for his jacket draped neatly over the chair, slipping it on with practiced precision, smoothing the fabric over his shoulders, adjusting the collar, every movement controlled, deliberate, untouched by urgency. In the mirror across the room, his reflection looked composed, successful, a man about to step into a celebration, not one leaving something behind. Emily's breathing grew shallower, her chest rising unevenly, and somewhere beneath the fear, beneath the confusion, a realization began to form, slow but undeniable, that he was not staying, that he had already chosen where he needed to be tonight. The baby moved again, a stronger kick this time, pressing against her abdomen, and she tried to focus on it, tried to respond, her fingers twitching slightly against the floor, searching for anything, any object, any chance to signal that she was still there. Richard picked up his keys from the dresser, the metallic jingle echoing louder than it should have in the quiet room, and he paused at the doorway, glancing back not at her face but at the phone, confirming the call log was clear, confirming the screen showed nothing but a blank recent history. Somewhere in the distance, faint and almost imagined, the echo of the dispatcher's voice lingered in Emily's mind, questions that would never be answered, help that had been just seconds away. Tonight matters, Richard murmured, more to himself than to her, as if justifying a decision already made long before this moment, and then he stepped into a hallway, the light shifting as his shadow disappeared, leaving the room dim again. The sound of his footsteps faded, steady and unhurried, followed by the soft click of the front door closing, a sound that seemed to seal the silence completely. Emily's vision narrowed further, the edges darkening as she struggled to keep her focus, her thoughts drifting toward the only thing that still felt real, the life inside her that refused to be quiet, that refused to disappear, and she tried once more to move, to reach, to do anything at all. But the distance between intention and action had become a gap she could no longer cross. Outside, the engine of Richard's car started smoothly, the low hum of it carrying away into the night, toward bright lights and laughter waiting miles away, while inside the house, time slowed to a fragile, uncertain rhythm, marked only by breath, by silence, and by the faint, persistent movement that reminded her she was not alone, even as everything else seemed to leave. The silence did not feel empty anymore, it felt loud, pressing against Emily Harper Whitmore's ears as if the house itself was listening, waiting, holding its breath along with her, and somewhere in that stillness she realized that no one was coming, not because help was far away, but because the path to it had been deliberately closed. Her eyes shifted slowly toward the nightstand where the phone had been, now out of reach. A simple distance that might as well have been a mile, and she tried to lift her arm again, focusing every fragment of strength she had left into that single motion, but the response came delayed, weak, her fingers dragging against the floor with a faint scraping sound that barely registered. The baby moved again, not frantic but steady, a quiet insistence that cut through the haze forming in her mind, and she clung to that rhythm, counting it, matching her breath to it, one slow inhale, one fragile exhale, as if the two of them were holding each other together in a way no one else could. Time stretched strangely, seconds folding into something longer, heavier, and the dim light from the hallway seemed to pulse in and out as her vision blurred at the edges. But she forced her focus back, searching, scanning the room for anything within reach, anything that could make a sound, anything that could carry her presence beyond these walls. Her left hand twitched again, stronger this time, and she pressed her palm against the floor, trying to push, to shift her body just an inch forward, the movement uneven and slow but real, and with it came a flicker of determination that cut through the fear, small but sharp, like a spark refusing to go out. She dragged herself forward another fraction, her breath catching as the effort pulled at her chest, and her gaze locked onto the edge of a small table near the wall where an old landline phone sat. Untouched for months, something they had never bothered to remove because it felt unnecessary, outdated, forgotten, but now it stood there like a distant possibility. The distance between her and that table measured only a few feet, but in that moment it felt like crossing an entire room with a body that no longer obeyed her fully. And still she tried, inch by inch, her movements guided not by strength but by urgency, by the quiet knowledge that stopping meant fading. And fading meant leaving something unfinished. The baby shifted again, a gentle, persistent motion, and Emily focused on it, letting it anchor her as she reached forward once more, her fingertips brushing against the edge of the rug, then sliding forward across the hardwood. Each inch gained a small victory against the weight pulling her back. Outside, distant city sounds carried faintly through the windows, the hum of traffic, a passing car, life continuing unaware. And for a moment she wondered if anyone out there could feel what was happening inside this house, if anyone could hear the silence stretching too long, but no one came, no sound answered. She pushed again, her breathing uneven but steady enough to continue, her mind narrowing to a single goal, one object, one chance, and though everything inside her body felt slower, heavier, there was something that refused to stop, something that kept moving forward. Even when the rest of her wanted to give in, and that was the part of her that still believed this moment was not the end. Some systems do not forget, even when someone powerful decides they should, and somewhere far from the quiet house, inside a softly lit dispatch center filled with glowing screens and steady voices, Laura Bennett paused mid-sentence as her headset picked up the abrupt end of a call that should not have ended that way. She stared at the monitor in front of her, the digital log blinking with a short duration timestamp, 9 seconds. flagged automatically as incomplete, and she leaned closer. Replaying the audio with a practice motion, listening again to the strained voice that had barely formed words. Pregnant, stroke, help! Followed by silence, then a man's voice, low, controlled, unfamiliar, and then nothing. Laura had handled thousands of calls over the years, some chaotic, some confusing, but there was a pattern to emergencies, a rhythm to fear, and this one felt wrong, cut too cleanly, too deliberately, like a door closed in the middle of a sentence. She tapped a few keys. Pulling up the caller information, the registered address appearing on the screen, a large property on the outskirts of the city, and she hesitated for only a second before flagging it for review, her instincts pushing past routine, telling her this was not something to ignore. Back in the house, Emily's hand finally brushed against the leg of the small table, the contact so slight it almost did not register. But it was enough to pull her focus forward again, enough to remind her that the distance she had crossed, however small, mattered, and she tried to lift her arm higher, her fingers searching upward, sliding along the smooth surface until they caught the edge, her grip weak but determined. The effort sent a wave of dizziness through her, her vision dimming further, but she held on, her body trembling under the strain, and for a moment everything seemed to balance on that single point of contact. Her hand against the table, her breath against the silence. At the dispatch center, Laura replayed the recording one more time, isolating the background audio, amplifying it just enough to catch the faintest detail, and there it was again, clearer now, the man's voice saying something she could not fully make out. But one word stood out unmistakably. Celebration. Spoken in a tone that did not belong anywhere near a medical emergency. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she made a decision that went slightly beyond standard protocol, marking the call for a welfare check, escalating it with a note that read simply, "Caller unable to continue, possible interference." And she sent it through, watching as the system acknowledged the request. Back on the floor, Emily's fingers tightened around the edge of the table, and with one last effort she pulled, the movement uneven and slow, but enough to shift her position just slightly, enough to bring her closer to the object above, the old landline resting there like a forgotten tool that suddenly mattered again. Her breathing remained fragile, her thoughts slipping at the edges, but something inside her held steady, something that refused to disappear. And as the quiet house continued to hold its breath, unseen processes began to move beyond its walls, small decisions, small signals, pieces falling into place in ways Richard had not considered when he walked out, in ways that did not require his permission, because some calls, no matter how short, do not end when the line goes silent. At the Grand Meridian Hotel, the lights shimmered like nothing in the world could ever go wrong, chandeliers casting soft gold across polished marble floors while quiet piano music filled the air, the kind of place where every detail was designed to feel perfect, controlled, untouched by anything messy or real, and Richard Whitmore walked through the glass doors with that same controlled precision, his posture straight, his expression calm. As if the night ahead had been planned down to the second. Inside the ballroom, laughter rose in gentle waves, guests dressed in tailored suits and elegant gowns holding glasses that caught the light, conversations flowing easily, and at the center of it all stood Vanessa Blake, radiant in a white dress that suggested something more than just a party, something closer to a beginning, her smile bright and confident as she greeted each guest like she had already claimed her place in this new chapter. When she saw Richard, her expression softened. Just enough to look genuine, and she stepped toward him without hesitation, her hand resting lightly on his arm as if it had always belonged there. "You made it," she said, her voice warm, carrying a hint of relief that quickly shifted into satisfaction, and Richard nodded, his focus already moving past the moment, scanning the room, acknowledging familiar faces, investors, colleagues, people who would remember this night for reasons he intended. A server passed by offering champagne, and Richard took a glass, the cool weight of it settling naturally in his hand as he lifted it slightly, testing the room. Feeling the attention begin to turn toward him, somewhere deep in his mind, a flicker of something tried to surface, a faint echo of a voice, a fragmented memory of a moment that did not belong in this polished space, but he pushed it aside without effort, replacing it with the narrative he had chosen, The version of events that allowed him to stand here without hesitation. Vanessa leaned closer, her voice lowering just enough to feel private. "Tonight changes everything," she said, and Richard gave a small smile, the kind that suggested agreement without revealing anything deeper, because for him, everything had already changed long before this night, long before this room, long before the quiet house he had left behind. The music shifted slightly, a cue more than a coincidence, and conversations began to quiet as attention gathered, subtle at first, then more focused, until the room itself seemed to pause in anticipation. Richard stepped forward, raising his glass higher now, the gesture drawing every eye, every expectation, and when he spoke, his voice carried easily, practiced, confident. "Tonight we celebrate new beginnings," he said, each word measured, each pause intentional, and the room responded with approving smiles, nods, the soft clink of glasses meeting in agreement. Vanessa's hand tightened slightly around his arm, her expression glowing with the promise of what she believed this moment meant, what it would bring, and for a brief second, Richard allowed himself to fully step into that version of reality, one where everything behind him had already been erased, one where nothing inconvenient remained, but far from the warm light of the ballroom, beyond the music and the laughter, something else had already begun to move, unseen, uninvited, and impossible to stop, because while this room celebrated what he thought was control, the truth was quietly building elsewhere, piece by piece, waiting for the moment it would no longer be ignored. While glasses clinked under soft, golden light and polite applause carried through the ballroom, miles away a different kind of silence was finally being interrupted, not by chance, but by a decision made in a quiet control room where routine had been quietly overridden. Laura Bennett leaned forward in her chair, her headset still resting against one ear as she watched the dispatch screen update in real time, the welfare check request she had flagged now accepted and assigned, a patrol unit already en route. The small green icon moving steadily across the map toward the address that had refused to leave her mind. She replayed the call again, just once more, not because she needed confirmation but because something in it felt unfinished, unresolved, like a sentence cut in half, and the faint echo of that strained voice lingered long after the audio stopped. Back at the house, the air felt heavier, thicker, the quiet stretching longer than it should. But Emily Harper Whitmore's hand remained locked around the edge of the table, her grip weak yet unyielding. And with a slow, deliberate motion she shifted again, her shoulder pressing against the side of the furniture as she tried to pull herself closer to the surface above. Her breathing came in uneven waves, but it continued, and with it came the steady, grounding movement from within, the baby's quiet insistence refusing to let her drift too far, each small motion a reminder that there was still something to hold on to. Her fingers searched upward, sliding along the table's edge until they brushed against the base of the landline phone, the contact faint but real, and for a moment her hand rested there as if gathering strength before attempting more. Outside, headlights cut briefly across the dark windows as a patrol car turned onto the long driveway, its presence subtle, unannounced, but moving closer with purpose, the tires rolling slowly over gravel as the officers inside exchanged a quick glance. Both aware that calls like this rarely meant nothing, at the hotel, laughter rose again, filling the space between speeches and quiet conversations, and Richard Whitmore stood among it all, his expression steady, his posture relaxed, every detail of his presence aligned with the image he had carefully built, while Vanessa Blake leaned beside him, her attention fixed on the future she believed was already secured. But even as the room moved forward in celebration, something else had already begun to shift beyond its reach, something that did not rely on invitations or appearances. At the house, a knock sounded at the front door, firm but measured, breaking through the stillness in a way that felt almost unreal, and when no response came, the officers exchanged another look before one stepped back, assessing the situation with trained instinct. Inside, Emily's fingers pressed against the landline, her strength fading but not gone, her focus narrowing to a single point, a single action that might carry her voice beyond the silence that had nearly taken it. And though the distance between intention and movement remained fragile, something unseen had already started to close that gap, piece by piece, second by second, until the moment could no longer be ignored. The second knock came louder, more deliberate, echoing through the quiet house with a sense of urgency that no longer asked for permission, and when it was met with the same silence, one of the officers stepped back and made a quick decision, his voice low but firm as he spoke into his radio, requesting authorization to enter, his eyes already scanning the windows, the stillness inside, the faint glow of a light left on too long, inside. Emily Harper Whitmore's hand trembled against the base of the landline, her fingers curling weakly around it as she tried to lift, to press, to do anything that might bridge the distance between her and the world outside, but the effort came in fragments, her body responding in slow, uneven signals that refused to align with what her mind demanded. Her breathing remained fragile, each inhale shallow, each exhale uncertain, yet it continued, anchored by the steady, quiet movement within her, the baby's presence a constant reminder that something still fought to stay. Outside, the officer nodded as the response came through his radio, and without hesitation, he moved to the side of the door, assessing the lock, the frame, the quickest point of entry, his partner stepping into position beside him, both of them aware that time was no longer something they could afford to waste. The sound that followed was sharp but controlled, the door giving way under practiced force. And within seconds they were inside, their voices cutting through the silence as they called out, announcing their presence, moving quickly but carefully through the space. The house answered with nothing at first. Just the lingering quiet that had settled too deeply, until one of them caught sight of movement near the far room, a faint shift that did not belong to stillness. "We have someone here," the officer said, his tone changing instantly as they approached, their steps quickening, their focus narrowing. Emily's vision flickered as shapes entered her field of view, unfamiliar but real, and for a moment she could not tell if they were part of the room or something else entirely. But then a voice reached her, clear, steady, asking if she could hear them, asking her to stay with them, and the words, simple as they were, carried a weight that cut through the haze surrounding her. Her fingers loosened slightly from the phone as the presence of others filled the space, replacing the silence with movement, with purpose, and though her body remained weak, her breathing uneven, something inside her responded to that shift, holding on just a little longer. Outside, the faint glow of emergency lights began to reflect against the windows, subtle at first, then stronger, casting moving patterns across the walls, a quiet signal that the moment had changed, that what had been hidden in stillness was now being seen. Miles away, in a room filled with laughter and raised glasses, Richard Whitmore stood untouched by the shift unfolding beyond his view, his attention fixed on the image he had created, unaware that the silence he had left behind had already been broken, and that the truth, once set in motion, was not something he could simply walk away from. The room that had once been silent now filled with controlled urgency, voices steady but quick, movements precise, and Emily Harper Whitmore felt herself being lifted into a moment she could barely hold on to, the world shifting around her as trained hands worked with quiet focus, checking, stabilizing, speaking to her even when her eyes struggled to stay open. Each word anchored in calm assurance that cut through the fading edges of her awareness. "Stay with us, Emily," a voice said, firm but gentle, and though she could not respond, something inside her registered the name, the connection, the fact that she was no longer alone in the quiet. Outside, the night carried the low hum of emergency vehicles now fully present, their lights casting rhythmic reflections across the driveway, across the walls, across the stillness that had almost swallowed everything, and the stretcher moved with careful speed, guiding her out of the house, into the open air where the world felt wider, louder, more real. Inside the ambulance, the environment changed again, focused and contained, monitors softly beeping, voices exchanging information in clear, measured tones, each detail noted, each second accounted for, and though Emily's body remained weak, her breathing fragile, the steady movement within her continued, a quiet, persistent rhythm that seemed to answer every effort made around her. Miles away, the Grand Meridian still shimmered under warm lights, but the atmosphere had shifted in a way no one could quite name, a subtle change in the air as the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough to draw a few curious glances that quickly spread into a ripple of attention. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, their presence composed, professional, yet unmistakable, and the contrast between their purpose and the celebration around them created a silence that grew in seconds, conversations fading, music lowering almost instinctively as the room adjusted to something it had not expected. Richard Whitmore noticed the shift before he saw them, a change in the way people looked, in the way the energy of the room turned slightly away from him, and when his gaze followed theirs, landing on the officers moving steadily in his direction, something flickered across his expression, brief but undeniable, before it settled back into control. Vanessa Blake's hand tightened slightly on his arm, her smile fading just enough to reveal uncertainty, her eyes searching his face for reassurance that did not come immediately. The officers stopped a few feet away, their voices calm, respectful, but firm, requesting his presence for a matter that required immediate attention. And though they did not raise their voices, though they did not create a scene, the weight of their words carried through the room, leaving no space for misunderstanding. For a moment, Richard said nothing, his mind moving quickly behind a composed exterior, calculating, adjusting, trying to place this interruption within the version of events he had already decided was complete. But the room was no longer his to control, and as he set his glass down slowly, the faint sound of it meeting the table seemed louder than it should have been, marking a shift that could not be undone. Somewhere between the house he had left and the hospital she was being taken to, the silence he thought he had created had already been replaced by something stronger, something recorded, something witnessed, and as he stepped away from the celebration, following the officers through the doors, the night outside felt different, not because it had changed, but because the truth had begun to catch up with him. The hospital corridor carried a different kind of quiet, not empty but controlled, every sound measured, every movement purposeful, and as the stretcher rolled through the automatic doors, Emily Harper Whitmore was guided into a space where seconds were no longer slipping unnoticed, where every breath, every response, every signal mattered. Voices surrounded her, calm but focused, calling out observations, confirming details. And though her awareness drifted in and out, she felt the shift, the undeniable change from isolation to intervention, from silence to action, and somewhere beneath it all, the steady movement within her remained, a quiet rhythm that refused to fade. Time moved differently here, not stretched and uncertain, but counted, tracked, each moment building towards something that had not yet been decided. Hours later, under softer light and quieter tones, Emily's eyes opened again, slowly. The world returning in fragments, shapes forming, sounds settling into meaning. And though her body still felt distant, unresponsive in ways she could not yet understand, her mind reached for something solid, something real, and her hand moved slightly against the surface beside her. A nurse noticed immediately, stepping closer, her voice gentle but clear, asking simple questions, guiding Emily back into awareness one word at a time, and though speech did not come easily, though her voice remained faint, there was recognition, there was presence, there was life continuing. A whiteboard was placed within reach, a marker pressed carefully into her left hand, and after a long pause, with effort that showed in every small movement, she wrote 2 words, uneven but unmistakable. He heard, and those words hung in the air longer than anything spoken, carrying a weight that shifted the room in a way no monitor ever could. Across the city, in a quiet interview room far removed from the bright lights of the ballroom, Richard Whitmore sat with his composure still intact. His posture straight, his voice measured as he answered questions with practiced control, each response carefully chosen, each explanation framed to fit a narrative that had worked for him before, but the details being presented did not bend as easily as he expected. A recording was played, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to fill the space, and the sound of a strained voice, broken but clear enough, carried through the room, followed by a moment of silence, then the faint echo of his own words, and for the first time, his expression shifted, not completely, not openly, but enough to reveal that something had moved beyond his control. The officers did not need to raise their voices, did not need to argue, because the evidence spoke in a way that did not rely on interpretation, and as the recording ended, the room settled into a quiet that felt heavier than before. Back at the hospital, Emily's hand rested lightly against her abdomen, her fingers still weak but steady enough to feel the movement beneath. The life that had stayed with her through every moment, through every silence. through every decision made without her, and she closed her eyes briefly, not in exhaustion but in something closer to resolve. The world around her continued to move, reports being written, statements being taken, processes unfolding in ways she did not need to control, because the truth no longer depended on strength or voice alone. Somewhere between the house where she had been left and the room where she now lay, everything had changed. Not with noise, not with confrontation, but with something quieter, something undeniable, the simple fact that what was meant to disappear had instead been heard, recorded, and carried forward, and as the night settled into morning, the difference between silence and truth became something no one could ignore.